Hi, welcome back to Tax Evasion on the Serengeti. Just kidding. Today we're going to talk about Agatha Christie's timeless work, Death on the Nile, in this episode of Conversations That Don't Help with Making Friends or Trivia. Death on the Nile is a 1937 novel by author Agatha Christie that has been reproduced for television, film, and radio, and is the subject of an upcoming blockbuster film that was slated for release in October of 2020, but has now been pushed back to February 2022. And we'll get into the reason for that a little bit later. Death on the Nile is Agatha Christie's 17th novel at an eventual 66 that she would write in detective fiction, whodunit genre. Whodunit kind of sounds like a board game that you would play, but it's actually a type of fiction that's like a puzzle where something happens and a main detective and the reader together sort of systematically eliminate all of the other characters in the book. This was basically how Agatha wrote all of her novels, and she used the same characters for the vast majority of her works. Belgian detective Hercule Poirot, I'm going to have so much trouble saying his name, was one of her main characters, who is this Belgian detective, and then Mrs. Marple, who is an elderly woman who is like an amateur sleuth. And she was very, very successful with these types of books. Agatha Christie was born in 1890 in the south of England, in Devon, to an upper-class wealthy family, where she was homeschooled and led a sort of idyllic life until she was 11 when her dad died. And she went from homeschool education to formal education, which she did not like at all, and she didn't very acclimate to very well. She had originally thought of being a concert pianist or a singer, but she wasn't exceptional at those things and didn't see a career happening. So instead, she turned her focus to writing, to being a writer. She was a voracious reader. She loved Arthur Conan Doyle, who was very popular at that time, and lots of other sort of childish fiction or detective fiction. She was really into it. In 1912, she was at some ball hosted by some lords and ladies, and she was introduced to Mr. Christie. Her birth name was Miller. She was Agatha Miller. So she met Mr. Christie in 1912, and they got married in 1914, right after the beginning of World War I. Mr. Christie was an officer in the British service, and he served for the entire war from 1914 to 1918, where he retired and went to work at a bank. So while he was at war, Agatha had been working on her writing career, and she developed the character Poirot in 2016 for her first book. She was having a lot of trouble finding publishers or finding anyone that was going to take a chance on her at that time. It wasn't really, I don't believe it was so much because she was a woman. There were very popular female authors at the time. It was just difficult for anybody to secure a literary contract, but she was having some trouble. In 1920, she finally got her first book published, and people loved it. She never had a problem publishing a book ever again because of the huge success that she had with her first book, and especially because the character Poirot was very similar to the character Sherlock Holmes, but he had a lot of negative idiosyncrasies, like obsessive compulsions, and like a short temper, or things that made him a lot more interesting or funny for the viewer. In 1926, her husband would serve her with a divorce, which sent Agatha into a nervous breakdown where she disappeared for 2 weeks. Her car was found abandoned with her license, her clothing, and she was discovered 2 weeks later at a hotel under a false name, claiming to be suffering from amnesia or an episode of dissociative fugue. Over 15,000 volunteers were sent out to look for her, 1,000 police officers. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle actually took out a want ad, or took out the front page of the New York Times offering a reward for her return. There was a lot of negative press. People thought it was a stunt. Other people sort of believed her, but she never talked about this period of her life ever again. But other people have written lots about it. That's really interesting if you want to go look that up yourself. But yeah, so after her divorce and her nervous breakdown, she took a train on the Orient Express to Iraq as part of her convalescent treatment. And when she went to the Middle East, she just fell in love with it. That was like she got like sort of a new lease on life. She felt invigorated. She felt incredibly inspired. She ended up meeting a archaeologist who was 10 years younger than her, and they quickly got married, and she spent the rest of her life traveling with him, traveling on her own, and getting inspiration for all of her future novels, and she lived happily ever after. The plot for Death on the Nile is pretty messy in the beginning. So the novel starts around a love triangle between three people, Lynette, Jacqueline, and Simon. So Jacqueline and Simon are engaged to be married, and they're like madly in love. And then Simon meets Jacqueline's friend, Lynette. And then Lynette and Simon start having an affair. And he leaves Jacqueline and then gets married to Lynette, and then they take their honeymoon in Egypt. So Jacqueline goes crazy, goes cuckoo, and is very angry. So she begins harassing them. So she's following them all around to restaurants, at bars. She's just third wheeling wherever they can go to just make them miserable all the time. And she has also followed them on their honeymoon to Egypt. So enter Mr. Poirot. The detective Poirot ends up being in Egypt for the same reasons that they kind of are. He's on holiday. He has just finished his investigation on the Orient Express. So he's there, and then Lynette and Poirot know each other because Lynette is like a famous socialite, so he recognizes her, and she recognizes him because he's a very famous detective, and she asks him for his help getting rid of Jacqueline. Like, not killing her, but just helping her to avoid Jacqueline or convince Jacqueline to leave them alone. Poirot refuses to do this. He's like, it's not my business. It's not what I do, honey. But, shocker, they all end up on the same cruise ship. So there's going to be a wooden cruise ship that's leaving from North Africa to Sudan, down the Nile. All four end up on the boat, and surprise, surprise, there's a murder. So now there's this crazy plot happening between the love triangle on the boat, but there's also a murder. And Mr. Poirot, for the 17th time in the novels, is put in charge of figuring out who is the killer. Death on the Nile was made into a 1978 movie starring an iconic cast, starring Dame Maggie Smith, Betty Davis, Angela Lansbury, and Mia Farrow. Like, it was a really, really great cast. It was really high camp, but it's an enduring classic. It's still a good movie if you watch it today. My personal enjoyment when I watched the movie is Maggie Smith was actually 44 when the movie was filmed, and there's lots of jokes about her being like this spinster old lady or that kind of thing throughout the movie, which is kind of funny because that's like 40 years before she was even in Harry Potter or Downton Abbey. In 2017, a remake of the 1974 movie Murder on the Orient Express was produced and directed by Sir Kenneth Branagh, who's a North Irish national treasure. He's a very, very famous actor. He was also in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, but he is directing this remake of the Murder on the Orient Express, which is a remake of the 1974 movie, which starred Sean Connery, Vanessa Redgrave, Albert Finney, and some other people. And because that movie was so successful, they decided to make a direct sequel with Death on the Nile. So Death on the Nile was was slated to be released in 2020, with Kenneth Branagh reprising his role as both director and the main lead, Mr. Poirot, and has an all-star cast. It has Gal Gadot, Dawn French, and Jennifer Saunders, who are, British legends, comedy icons. Russell Brand will be in it, Letitia Wright, who is Shuri from the Marvel movies, and just a long list of very, very great actors. Especially the Murder on the Orient Express one had Johnny Depp, had Judi Dench, had Olivia Colman, Michelle Pfeiffer. Like, these are very, very big names. So Murder on the Orient Express was supposed to come out, the 2020 version was supposed to come out in October. However, the first problem was that Disney had recently acquired Fox, whatever division of movies they make. They acquired Fox, and then the pandemic sort of shut everything down. The big lockdown started happening, so the movie was like, okay, we don't know when we're going to put it out. Possibly February of 2021, which would have been recently. However, in January of 2021, it was revealed that one of the central characters in the 2020 remake, Armie Hammer, was alleged to have some very bad deviant inclinations that are currently the subject of investigation. So Armie Hammer has been accused of insisting on non-consensual BDSM sort of fantasies, rape fantasies, and one partner has even alleged that he psychologically pressured her into having her ribs removed so he could eat them. Yeah, so they're saying that dude is a cannibal. He's been dropped by all of his publicists and blah, 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 blah. Like this just kind of derailed everything. So the movie has now been put off until February 2022, so a whole other year, while Mr. Hammer's, the main character's legal disputes are sorted out and they kind of figure out what to do about the movie. Unfortunately, Armie Hammer plays the role of Simon Doyle, who is one of the love triangle from the plot before. And you can't CGI him out. You can't recast the scenes. Like, the cast is so A-list that you can't just like refilm those scenes because it would just be prohibitively expensive. It would take way too much time. You can't cut him out of the movie because he's so central to the plot, and they are not considering the possibility of CGIing him. But the movie can't be pulled off the shelves indefinitely because so many people worked on it, and it just kind of wouldn't be fair to everybody else that was involved in the movie and everybody that worked on it. So that's what's happening with that movie. So Kenneth Branagh, who directed the first one and the second one and stars as the main character, has also discussed the possibility of an Agatha Christie cinematic universe, which he's trying to accomplish, much in the same vein as other cinematic universes, like the DC one with The Dark Knight or the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is quite interesting because Kenneth Branagh actually directed the movie Thor in 2011, which was one of the first movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and led to the MCU actually being a thing in general. So he has every intention of doing that with Agatha Christie's books. So now we await the fate of Death on the Nile and see what happens. We see what happens with Armie Hammer and, just keep our fingers crossed, see what happens. All right, thank you so much for listening, and please like, comment, and subscribe. Bye!